Great. Thanks, Megan. This is such an important topic, so I'm glad that those of you online are there, those of you in person are here. It's something that's timely. It's coming up in Washington State once again. So please feel free, especially those online, at any time during the time this broadcast, submit your questions. For those of you in person, we're going to take questions at the end only because some of the things may be addressed that you have questions about. But we want to have this as engaging as we can. So I know that Megan said we have 10 minutes. Hopefully, especially if we have a sense that there's a lot of questions, we'll have more in 10 minutes. Colleen, let me just start off because I think as a baseline, what everybody wants to know is what's the current status of the law?
Yeah, so since 2006 in Washington State, gender identity and gender expression have been protected classes under the Washington Law Against Discrimination. And so that's our state-level civil rights statute. There are civil rights protections that exist at the national level, but here in Washington we have a nice, broad civil rights statute that protects transgender people from discrimination in employment, in housing, at school, by businesses that are sort of open to the public for business, in credit transactions, so in like a lending transaction, or by an insurance company. So for over 10 years in this state, that's been the law on the books and is still the law today.
Has there been a recent change by the Washington State Human Rights Commission? Maybe I'm leading up to something, but I take it the Human Rights Commission is the one that, in a sense, looks at the enforcement of these provisions. Is that right?
Yeah. So the legislature, the Washington State Legislature, has given the Human Rights Commission the responsibility for issuing regulations to clarify or interpret the Washington Law Against Discrimination. And in 2015, the Human Rights Commission completed a rulemaking to clarify how the prohibition on gender identity discrimination applies in certain contexts. And so they issued regulations that talk about how employment discrimination works when the discrimination is against a transgender person, what the context of public accommodation discrimination is, and one small piece of their regulations that got, I think, a lot of attention, media attention and otherwise, was around access to what are known as sex-segregated facilities. So things like bathrooms, locker rooms, and other places where typically you see sort of a men's version and a women's version. The regulation clarified that transgender people have the right to use the sex-segregated facility that corresponds with their gender identity. One point I'll make is that didn't change the law or make new law. It was the Human Rights Commission clarifying what the law has been since 2006.
And so this 2006 law, that was actually put in place by the legislature?
The 2006 law is a legislative statute.
Okay, so it's not the Human Rights Commission that's making up these rules. It's the legislature that sets the parameters here. Is that right?
That's right.
And so the Human Rights Commission simply did a clarification. Did they have any input when they're making this clarification?
Yeah, their process was a multi-year process that involved meetings that they held around the state asking for input from both, people who might be LGBT activists, transgender people themselves, community groups, and also entities that were going to be subject to the rules. So they accepted input from people like employers, housing providers, businesses, or others who fall under our state-level law.
So your division, the Civil Rights Division of the Attorney General's Office, actually, if it has to, goes to court over these rules, is that right?
Mm-hmm.
But do you try to work it out with, if you will, places of public accommodations before you have to go to that step?
Yeah, always. So in my unit, we do have the authority to bring litigation or lawsuits against an entity that is not complying or is failing or omitting to comply with the Washington Law Against Discrimination. But before we do that, we always send a letter saying, hey, we've heard about this that's going on. We've looked into it. We're concerned. Would you like to meet? Would you like to resolve voluntarily any discrimination that may be going on?
So let me ask you this. As far as this clarification, how has that been going? As far as reaching out to different businesses, have they been cooperating? Do they understand why this change or why this clarification has been made?
Yeah, I think a lot of them need kind of technical guidance. How do we make this work in practice? And we're happy to try to provide resources that make clear that this is pretty workable and can be very low cost. I'll add that at the school level, and really Kelly can talk about this in more detail probably than I can, but our schools have a lot of good experience implementing the rule that students at school, have the right to be themselves at school and to use the sort of locker room and bathroom that corresponds to their gender identity. And there's been a lot of low cost and effective solutions that both businesses, sort of employers, and then schools have been able to develop and implement to make sure that we're protecting the civil rights of transgender folks while not changing, everything about the bathrooms and locker rooms that already exist. There's no reason to do that, and that's not been our experience here in the state.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some more questions about the current law, but since you brought up the education, and Kelly's right there, and I can tell she's raring to go. So Kelly, how have school districts dealt with this? Is this a big change for the school districts, or have some of them already had rules of their own in place?
Most of them already had rules in place. So in addition to the
Gunnar.
Oh, thank you. In addition to the Washington law against discrimination, there's also a RCW and a WAC about non-discrimination in public schools.
Okay, so tell us about how schools dealt, even before the Human Rights Commission came out with their clarification.
Sure.
How were school districts dealing with this?
A lot of them have policies, and it depends. In
Can
Washington,
you share some of those, or how some were dealing?
Sure, they'll have policies that talk about ensuring non-discrimination, allowing students to choose their use of pronouns, what name they get to use, what to do in official documents and non-official documents, whether or not students get to, and they do, get to participate in the sports activities of the gender identity that they identify with. And they have rules about locker rooms and restrooms and ensuring that students get to use those consistent with their gender identity. So many school districts and many states even have policies and have had policies on these issues for quite some time.
Okay, so many, but I take it not all, had policies before.
Yeah, for
Okay.
some it hadn't come up as a conscious issue that they needed to address. It's obviously been a lot in the papers and has been a high-profile issue, particularly on the federal level. The federal U.S. Department of Education issued guidance in 2015 and 2016 that some people thought pushed Title IX too far. Title IX is a federal civil rights act protecting people from discrimination on the basis of sex, and sex is interpreted broadly under that statute. When that guidance was issued on the federal level, there were two parts there was the Department of Justice, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, all issued guidance on how to deal with transgender students and in doing that, they surveyed a broad number of states saying what kinds of policies and procedures. They looked at different school districts, they looked at New York, they looked at Washington, and said, what are districts doing? How are they doing this so that we can give guidance to other districts, and issued that guidance. There was a bit of backlash, as we're seeing in our state as well, to some of those policies and procedures.
And I want to hear about that backlash,
Sure.
especially from Gunnar. But before I move on to Gunnar,
Sure.
Has there been a difference in the way that maybe students approach this as opposed to parents? Have you seen that? You're laughing, so maybe that's a yes right there. But can you talk about that?
Other students don't have the concerns that parents have, has been my experience. Students are fine with other students' gender identities, pretty much. I mean, there are always exceptions. It is usually the school board and the administrators who are having the very strong emotional reactions to students' gender identity. In some of the court cases that you might read about, you can see that the student went for months using the locker room of their gender identity with no problem with other students or teachers or faculty. It was when administrators or school board members found out about it that it became an issue.
Gunnar, has that been your experience as well? I'm talking just about the school districts now, then I'm going to move on to the general population.
Yeah, it's definitely been an issue that I've seen, and a lot of times, I mean, in some cases, if it's a younger child, the parent has gone to the school proactively to say, here's what's going on in my family, and have, been pretty honest. And in some cases, I've seen the school administrators have been extremely disrespectful, discriminatory. I've had situations with families who have said, the school principal has said, I want your kid just to quit. It'd be easier. That's the level it's gone to. And for other folks, sometimes the parents aren't as accepting, and so the student is doing a lot of advocating on their own behalf. And then they're feeling like they're being disrespected as a transgender person, but also as a young person, and not being listened to about the authenticity of their life. So that's definitely, and I think what I like to think about is that we all have rights already. And, one thing I used to talk about when I was doing advocacy work was, before I came out and transitioned, I had these rights, and now just because I've transitioned, they've magically gone away. So it's also just an interesting concept to think about, why is it that at this point in my life I had them and at this point I don't. And I think, we're seeing, I want to call it a revolution, but we have this opportunity now where there's more education and more understanding. So we're seeing young people be able to be themselves earlier, which is not something that happened for some my age, that came out in the, that grew up in the 70s and 80s. And so, there's this myth that we just arrived and this is just happening, and that's not true. It's that there's more understanding and more education, and there's more supportive parents out there that have the ability to find that information. My dad is in his 70s, and he always says to me how sorry he feels that he didn't know more. And I was like, you wouldn't have been able to find it. We didn't have the internet. You wouldn't be able to Google it. So I think it's, the law and the policies are catching up to what's already been happening.
So maybe not a revolution, but an evolution going along these lines. So let me ask you about that. We just had about the school, and I'm jumping again, Gunnar. How do you see this change, this clarification, I shouldn't say change, this clarification, and maybe some of the changes that have been made because of the clarification in the general society outside of schools? Are people being accepting? Are there really problems with people abiding by the law?
Well, I think first, let's just say transgender people have been using the bathrooms and restrooms and locker rooms of how they identify and present. And if we hadn't been doing that, you all would know, and there'd be a lot more problems. I mean, when I started my work in this field, I would talk to journalists, and they would expect me to be a male to female transgender woman. And I'd say, no, I'm a female to male transgender man because we're pretty invisible. And I would say, the opposition wants people who look like me to be in the women's room. And that's going to be very confusing. And so, just
Can you just repeat that? Because I think sometimes people forget that. So repeat that one more time.
Sure. So the opposition, folks that are saying, some of the bills that have come out that have said, people have to use restrooms consistent with their sex at birth, they're saying that someone who looks like me as a transgender man is then required to use the women's room. And I will tell you, when I knew it was time for me to stop using the women's room, early in my transition, I was at a rest stop in Maine, and I came out of the women's room, and someone I would label as like a grandma age woman looked at me and then went into the men's room. And it was purely because she thought I was coming out of the men's room. And I said, okay, it's time. So, it's... Most folks, you've shared a bathroom with a trans person you didn't even know. And it is because I think what makes us very different is that oftentimes we have to disclose private medical information about ourselves in ways that other people do not. That in this day and age, because of databases and where we are and with everything being connected, I can no longer erase the F that I was born with on my documents. I can change them, but somewhere there's going to be a record. That wasn't the case in the 70s, 60s, 50s. So folks were able to pick up, move away, transition, and nobody knew who they were. That's not the case anymore, and that's not what people want to do anymore either. So the clarification gives businesses, organizations the tools to be able to say to the person who might be, I think there was a man in the women's room, to say, no, that, was the person harassing you? Did they do something to hurt you? No. Okay, well, they can use the bathroom just like anybody else. And it's just because that person's perception of what a man or a woman should be is so narrow. And I mean, this law is not just about transgender people. And if anything, most of the calls that I got from folks experiencing harassment in bathrooms were actually women who were not feminine enough. Those are the folks who end up getting kind of hurt on the front line around this. And then it is other older trans people who maybe transition later in life. And so this law lifts all boats for all people. It's not just about trans folks. And I think that's something that people forget. It's about you get to be who you are. And, we've been undoing all of these kind of laws that have regulated our bodies and who we are and how we present. And this is just one of those places that we're undoing it.
So you bring up a point about some of the opposition saying, it's going to be abused and all the stuff. So, Kelly, let me ask you this. Have you heard of experiences now where the law is being abused? Let's say that a high school boy, for some reason, wants to go in the or the girls' locker room, and so goes in there and says, well, I'm allowed to do that. Have you heard of any of those instances?
I haven't heard of any of them. I have heard people who are opposed to transgender folks using the bathroom of their gender identity having concerns about that. The larger concern is transgender folks being abused in bathrooms. That's the stories that I hear, is the bullying, the harassment, and the physical attacks that happen to transgender people when they use the restroom. I don't see a lot of non-transgender people trying to pretend to be transgender so that they can get in the bathroom.
Have you seen any?
No.
Okay.
Honestly,
okay.
I haven't. And part of it is because it's difficult to be a transgender person that's known as a transgender person. You face bullying, you face harassment. People don't put themselves out to be the subjects of discrimination. And right now we are seeing a lot of discrimination.
Just not right now, but probably historically as well. Colleen, let me go back and what is the law? So we obviously know it applies to schools now because we've been talking about schools, but it's public accommodations. So what does that mean? What is a place of public accommodation so that people know, when this applies and when it doesn't apply?
Yeah, it's an umbrella legal term that basically covers any business or service that is open generally to the public and kept for hire. So kind of when you open yourself up as a business that wants to do business and conduct business, make money, it's a very broad definition that's going to cover that. So we're talking about, sort of gas stations and restaurants and, bars and hotels, healthcare facilities, swimming pools. I mean, just anywhere where kind of the public knows that everybody's welcome to show up, pay whatever fee is required to participate, and those are the conditions. So it's, private clubs might be excluded or churches might be excluded where you need to be a member to participate. But if it's a generally come one, come all situation, that's a place of public accommodation.
Okay, so someone's, if you will, country club is at a private place is not a public accommodation.
It depends on whether it's really open to the public,
right,
whether they really kind of take you if you want to sign up. But if there is some,
if it's really a private club where they keep track of who becomes a member and
yeah, you have to be invited.
That.
Yeah,
And
there might be exceptions for that.
And the same thing with a religious place. I mean,
yeah, there's certain exceptions for religious entities that have kind of a religious mission and purpose.
But if I'm just talking about a Gold's Gym where, you're a member, but it's open to everybody, is that a place of public accommodation?
Right, yeah. The general test is think if, just Joe Blow off the street walks in and wants to sign up, if they're going to take him, then it's a place of public accommodation. Doors open, anybody can walk in and ask to pay the fee and sign up for service.
And Gunnar, we touched a little bit about it before. I think Kelly did, but I think it is important to talk about this. So historically, what have transgender women and men faced as far as the problems? And I think, what we hear and what maybe people don't realize, and I want you to elaborate on this.
Sure.
What those women and men have to do. Like a lot of them won't drink during the day or eat during the day.
Yeah, those aren't historic. I mean, those are things still happening.
Still happening,
yes.
But I want to make sure that that's in the past, and you're right.
Yeah, it's still happening.
I want to make sure we know why the law is the way it is. So can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, I think it's also, there's a combination of people's self-confidence, too. So if someone feels like they're not being seen as the gender they are, and I've gone through this in my transition at different points, then I'm going to avoid places that I may get into a situation where I experience discrimination or harassment. When I was educating trans folks on talking to policymakers, I would say, many people would say, well, I've never had a direct experience where I got fired or I got kicked out of somewhere. And I'd say, think about the places that you limit your life, that you don't go, or you're afraid to go, or you have some, you won't take that step. For me, it was the gym for a long time. And it was the fact of going into a space that is so gendered in some ways. And I mean, today I still don't. I go to the gym dressed in my gym clothes and I leave, and I don't ever use the locker rooms other than to put my stuff in it because it just feels too scary for me. And nothing's happened. I mean, actually, plenty of people in my gym know that I'm transgender and go out of their way to be supportive, which is fine, which also feels a little awkward sometimes. But, it's nothing. But because I've worked with so many folks that have experienced that, because they did not appear the way someone expects a woman to look like, particularly for younger transgender women of color. I mean, the combination of racism and being trans is really a deadly combination. And so that community in particular is the one who gets really impacted when we have these type of ballot initiatives or anti-trans, rhetoric coming at us. It's not somebody like me. I often pass and nobody really thinks anything different of me, but we see with younger trans women of color, that combination is really deadly. We're losing 1 to 2 young trans women of color each month from violence, from murder. And it is in places of public accommodations in some cases, trying to access a cab, trying to go into McDonald's, there are way too many stories to tell of folks that have been killed just trying to live their everyday life. And I think that is not historic, unfortunately. I wish it was, but what we're seeing is a continuation of that. And it is levels of violence. Folks experience physical violence, sexual assault, things like that. And those stories don't come out because imagine being a survivor of that and having to speak about that. And while places like the Attorney General's office and other city civil rights groups get some complaints, the majority of them don't go filed. And I have sat with those folks, and it's really sometimes for them, just telling another person it happened is hard enough, let alone move forward, be public, and worry about all that scrutiny that comes with it. So having laws on the books is prevention, and is ability for people to feel secure in that they can go and live their lives. And we have so many people who are underemployed, unemployed, who, transgender people in general, we have double the rate of college graduation than the general public. So you think about all these folks who are really highly educated and can't get jobs. And part of that is discrimination. That is, continues to be. So there is, the only historics that's changed really is that back in the 50s and 60s, we had laws on the books that said you had to have 3 pieces of clothing based on your sex, your gender, and we don't have those anymore. Until now, if any of these passes, that's what we're moving towards again. We're going back to the 50s and 60s, where, you couldn't openly serve somebody who was a avowed homosexual or wasn't wearing the right gendered clothings and things like that. And we see this in other places with hairstyles and things. Again, it doesn't just affect trans people. It affects a lot of different communities, particularly marginalized and oppressed communities.
Okay, and we're going to get to the proposed, trying to get the I-1552 initiative. Before we get there, Colleen, a couple of questions for you. One is, you said that the AG's office will help organizations work to comply with this clarification. So what are some of the things that the AG's office suggests? Can you give us some examples of what you've done to help
Oh, sure.
compliance?
I mean, so we'll work with organizations who are struggling to figure out whether they fall under the law, and if so, what their obligations are going to be. I'll say that the primary entity that does some of the frequently asked questions and some of the technical guidance is the Human Rights Commission itself, because it is it's the entity that really is a subject matter expert about the regulations that it wrote and that it deemed necessary through these public meetings to sort of give some guidance to businesses who are saying, hey, we want to comply with this, but we don't really understand what the guardrails are and where we need to be. And so that was the origin of the rulemaking.
So one thing that people can do is probably just go on the Human Rights Commission's website, and it'll give probably a list of frequently asked questions and addressing some of those.
Exactly, with links and things in them. So including to like model policies. So if an employer, a large employer, let's say it needs to rewrite its HR policies in order to comply with this, there's going to be samples and resources available. The same is true in the school context, the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the elected head of our K through 12 public schools, has model policies on its website, and the University of Washington, our kind of flagship school here in Seattle, has a policy that's pretty well done in order for kind of higher education. A different set of students, a different set of faculty can look at that too. And so if we're asked to help an entity figure out whether they comply, we'll look at the law and say, yeah, you're covered, or no, you're not. But we can also point to resources that say, depending on which kind of an entity you are, a different kind of policy is going to make sense for you. Are you the Gold's Gym, or are you the University of Washington? Like, there's a lot of different things going on there. And so context matters.
Okay. And has the AG's office actually had to bring suit? I mean, some public accommodation, place of public accommodation has refused to comply. Have you actually had to go to court and enforce the clarification?
We haven't gone to yes. So we've. Okay. Sorry, I was about to say no, but the answer is we've brought an enforcement action in the employment context involving, on behalf of our client, the Human Rights Commission, in a case involving a transgender farm worker in Pasco. And in farm work, there's often seasonal layoffs, so you kind of get formally hired and laid off several times through the course of a season. And what happened was this woman, she's a transgender woman, and she was hired, and the employer who hired her did not know that she was transgender. She had long hair, and she, there was nothing about her that would let them know. But then the employer learned of it at some point and started engaging in kind of gender identity harassment of her, criticizing her, the outfits that she wore to work, even though they were really similar to the ones that her other female colleagues were wearing, nitpicking how she wore her hair, even though it was similar to the hairstyles worn by her female colleagues, and then telling her that, saying to her that oh, hey, your colleagues, your coworkers don't want you using the bathroom because you're probably going to give everybody STDs, and telling her that they were going to get a separate porta potty that they were going to put out back that would be the one that she would use and that would be assigned to her. So she experienced this while she was working there, and then there was a seasonal layoff where everybody was given kind of 2 weeks off. The way it works is the boss calls and says, hey, we're starting back up on Thursday, be there, be square, and she didn't get that call. And so she only found out that everybody else, all of her other colleagues, were going back to work when one of her friends had said, hey, are you showing up on Thursday? And she said, oh, for what? Like, nobody called me. And so we filed that case on behalf of our client, the Human Rights Commission, alleging employment discrimination on the basis of gender identity, and were able to settle it during litigation. We've also filed a number of amicus briefs in individual cases where we act as not the plaintiff, but as a sort of friend of the court, a party who has a view about the law and what the right answer is. And we've done that in cases around the country, and then including as locally as here in King County, when a business is discriminating against a business, a school, or an employer is discriminating against a transgender person.
Kelly, have you seen any instances where school districts are having a hard time complying with this clarification?
Sure, and there's been some highly public. Oh.
We'll get it before the end of the hour.
I'm trying to,
we will
knock
train
off in
you.
the microphone. I'll get trained. There have been some well-publicized, actually, federal cases on these issues.
Well, tell us about this, would you, just so we help.
Sure. So there's one that made its way all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. Based on Title IX guidance, made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. A school district, the Gloucester County School Board, was discriminating against.
Sounds like Massachusetts.
Yes,
okay.
Was against a student who was going
Gloucester.
by. I think it's
Gloucester.
It's Gloucester.
I'm from Boston.
All right, you're going to take care of me the whole time. So glad you're sitting next to me. I'm not going to try to say that city again. And the student was GG, but now has come out with his full name since he's 18. And that made it all the way to the Supreme Court based on the U.S. Department of Education's guidance. When it got to the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice pulled and withdrew its federal guidance about transgender student, and then notified the court saying, we've withdrawn this guidance, we're going to take a new look at it. We don't think it's appropriate for you to hear this decision right now. The U.S. Supreme Court said, we agree, issued a one-sentence decision and kicked it back to the Fourth Circuit. So the Fourth Circuit is looking at the issue of transgender discrimination for that student. Meanwhile, just on May 30th, just last week, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in Whitaker versus, I'm going to probably slaughter this one too, Kenosha Unified School District issued a decision regarding a transgender student. And that decision is actually really interesting in terms of how these things affect students. There is, part of the record is that the student wasn't using the restroom because of some of the things, and it was causing actual physical health problems because he wasn't using the restroom. So those are the big ones. There are also little ones around the country, and then there are individual cases that are brought on a local level or to an individual school district. Many of them get resolved pretty quickly because there is a lot of guidance out there, but some of them are making it, all the way up to the Supreme Court and to the circuit court level.
So let me throw this question out to all three of you. And by me asking this question doesn't mean that I adopt the views of the question, make that very clear, and okay. But you'll hear this a lot in the kind of the general talk. Why can't we just have a separate bathroom for transgender women or transgender men or separate locker facilities? Why doesn't that work? Who wants to address that? Because I'm sure there's people, especially online, who may have that same question, and I'll ask that. Gunnar, you pushed your button. It was like Jeopardy.
I mean, haven't we tried that before with
just because I'm
African American people? I mean, I'm just throwing that out as
okay.
Like we have, separate is not equal. I think we've learned that history from hopefully we're learning that history lesson, but obviously not. One is just that, there's a lot of conversations about bathrooms in general. I mean, bathrooms only became sex segregated in like the early 1800s because of the World's Fair in Paris. There's a whole book called Queering Bathrooms. If you're really into bathrooms, I read a lot of plumbing code and a lot of history around bathrooms.
Repeat that title, because there may actually be some...
Queering Bathrooms.
Queering Bathrooms.
Yeah,
okay,
it gives you the
everybody got
history
that?
of how sex-segregated bathrooms came about. One is that there is no need for that. I think we have the needs around bathrooms is that it's really about people being able to take care of what they need to take care of. We've had similar frictions around bathrooms when it comes to folks with disabilities, seniors, young children, folks of color. Kate Clinton, who is a comic in the GLBT community, always says, you're winning when they start talking about bathrooms. So I feel that way. We've gotten to that point. And, at the end of the day, what we really need to think about is, what is comfortable for our folks. I mean, many systems have been set up. I've done a lot of work in social services, and the men's homeless shelter will have open showers. And why is it that men don't get any privacy, versus women who might get some privacy or not? Again, like each person should be able to have space that they feel. For someone, they may want a more private space. And so creating a more private space for anyone who might want to use it is fine. But when you say only this group of people, and then how do you define what that group of people is? How are you going to know? Nobody knows me walking in someplace, and all my IDs that I use list me as male. So how are you going to know? And it's really based on who's pretty. It's all about aesthetics at the end of the day. Because if you start asking me what's in my pants, that's sexual harassment. That crosses a line. And I think that's what these types of questions and things like that, when people say that, it really starts to cross the line around sexual harassment and sexual invasion, I think, about people's bodies and who they are.
Colleen, you pressed your button.
I agree with all of that. And the legal reason why you can't have a separate sort of facility out here, why you can't give this one worker her own porta potty in the back of the work area, is because we have this whole body of law that says that when you start picking individuals out for different and less favorable treatment, you've got a discrimination claim. And that's going to be true under the federal Constitution, under some of our federal laws, and certainly under state law, that it might make everybody else, somehow feel better to take this person and give them this other or separate status. But that act of othering somebody and giving, physically separating or otherwise treating both differently and less favorably is the classic crux of what a discrimination violation would be.
Kelly?
And I'm just going to go more practical, which is a lot of businesses and schools can't afford to do that. So I'm not disagreeing with these. I don't think that we should have separate and unequal facilities, but small businesses can't afford to put in a third restroom. School districts are already struggling with funding, and now we're going to ask that they have additional bathrooms. And then I think the other point is, how do you know? I worked with a small youth-serving organization who had a transgender student who wanted to participate. It was an all-girls program, and they were, what do we do? Well, you don't ask any of your other participants to lift up their skirts to prove their femaleness. So are we going to create a situation where people are asking other people going into the bathrooms to prove their gender, which is what this initiative would do? It also has a $5,000 cost every time a student uses the restroom of their gender identity that may not conform with their biological identity. So there are a lot of impractical and fiscal considerations about some of these things, as well as the human ones and the discriminatory ones.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the kind of bathroom police that we see as the only and inevitable consequence of a policy that mandates that you use the facilities that correspond with gender at birth. So you're going to need that bathroom police, and on whom does that fall? So if I'm operating the restaurant, if I'm the franchisee that owns the McDonald's, like, is that on me? Is it on other members of the public? Are we to police each other? I mean, there are real problems with the idea of, you know, some requirement that we use non-obvious criteria to determine who belongs in which bathroom and what for.
So, Gunnar, we've been talking about this proposed. It's not an initiative; it's a proposed initiative. They're gathering signatures right now. So, tell us what are you familiar with the terms of the initiative?
I'm familiar with some of the terms of the initiative.
Okay, so share
honestly,
with what you know with the audience.
It gives me some trauma to read it. Having worked so hard in another part of the country to pass a state law that include public accommodations and having these conversations, and honestly, I moved to Washington because everything was done. I was like, oh, I can have a break. But it's about the proposed initiative and other legislative proposals they've done has something to do with basically requiring people who are transgender to use the restrooms, locker rooms, and other facilities that might show nudity based on their assigned sex, regardless if you've changed your identity documents. And it's not clear around if folks have had surgery or not. I don't think they've actually thought that deeply about it. And then there was the possibility of a fine. I'm not sure. There's so many of them, honestly, right now. It's hard to keep track of which is the worst one of them all. They seem to be upping each other on that. There was a situation in one of the southern states where they wanted to allow people to hurt somebody physically, to physically throw them out of a location as part of the legislation. Like, that's the level it's gone to. It's not here in Washington, but the idea is that they need to keep so-called predators from being able to access the public accommodations law, which, as folks have already answered, is not something that folks are doing. There's been one situation where somebody went in the pool area of a Seattle pool and didn't claim to be transgender, was dressed as a man, went into the women's locker room and said, I just can be here. And the staff said, no, you can't. And so we've seen setups where people have been set up. I've had that happen with when I was doing other advocacy work in another state. That is something that's not unusual for the opposition to send somebody in and either call 911 when a trans person comes in or make a claim. So that's one thing we do see happening.
Kelly, you mentioned a $5,000 fine. Is that part of the proposal for the proposed 1552?
Yeah, and it would require people prove their sex at birth. So it would require that people carry their birth certificates and other things. It's just not practical to implicate. But there is one piece of it that would encourage lawsuits against public schools, and it's would give K through 12 students the ability to sue their public schools for a minimum of $5,000 for every time they encounter a transgender student in a gender-segregated facility. Okay.
So that would be against the school district itself.
Right. And so school districts would have to defend those, and it would create a lot of problems. And that's just in the school context. It would also impact employment and employers. It could impact housing. Businesses have come out against this initiative. So Alaska Airlines, Amazon, Adobe, Microsoft, Vulcan, Google have all said these types of laws would inhibit our ability to get high-quality workers and their families to move to our state. And that's sort of what North Carolina's seen.
So let's talk, well,
Oh, I was just going to add that in the work that we do, both in the state but also nationally on this issue in the Attorney General's office, what we encounter are businesses that say that a climate of tolerance and inclusion and civility benefits everybody, whether you're transgender or not, and that the very highest quality employees, those folks who we most want to attract, highly skilled, high quality folks, are looking for those employment opportunities where we're going to have that kind of a climate where we treat each other respectfully and where there are rules that really are the normative requirements that we be civil to each other. And so I think from a sort of a business and a recruitment perspective, look, the state of Washington is an employer too. And so we like the idea from an employment perspective that we're creating a culture of inclusion and civility because it attracts the kinds of workers that we want.
who can tell us about what happened in North Carolina? Because they instituted one of these things. What was the economic cost to the state and the businesses in the state?
Well, I think first was that other states said we're not going to hold conferences, we're not going to go to meetings there. The city of Seattle said, none of the city workers can go to any conferences or meetings being held in the state. So there was that piece. We saw the college basketball. I'm not a college basketball person, but they pulled out of having their tournament there. Is that the right word?
I wish I could help.
Gardening. I can talk about gardening.
NCAA tournament.
Thank you. And then we've seen businesses that have thought about relocating, whether it's their headquarters or just opening up another shop there, saying, you know what, we're not going to do that. So that has had a toll. And then tourism. North Carolina, I briefly lived there, and it's beautiful. And, I'll never go back while it's in place, whether it's transgender people or LGBT or just general public. And so my godchild's grandparents lives in North Carolina, and he is transgender. He's F to M, and he's afraid he's never going to see his grandmother again while she's alive because he's fearful to go back down there. He's a young 16-year-old F to M. So just on like a personal level, it's affecting families. It's actually, causing rifts in families, so people can't visit their relatives if they live there. So it's been an economic impact. It's also, kind of made North Carolina a laughingstock of the rest of the world too, in some ways.
Kelly?
I just had the data in front of me.
Oh,
So,
good. Well, share it then with us.
well, economic experts from the Williams Institute say that Washington State could lose billions, $3.7 billion over the next 12 years as businesses, tourists, and conventions go elsewhere. And it also says that when HB2 in North Carolina went into effect last year, they've lost $600 million since then. So think about how that affects our tax base, our businesses, and those sorts of things. And our sense of safety and our sense of inclusion and sense of Washington as a welcome opening place for everybody.
Have any of you three seen really an abuse of locker rooms, bathrooms, because of the recent clarification?
So no, and I think it's really important to separate out the person from the conduct. So long before 2015 or 2006, forever, it's been against the rules or against the law to do certain kinds of things in bathrooms that get in someone else's space, touch somebody without their permission. Things like voyeurism and assault have been against the law forever, and we know how to enforce. Our local police departments and our county sheriffs know how to police those kinds of activities. So the idea that a certain person is automatically more likely to do one of that kind of behavior, I think, is a real misunderstanding and a misplaced fear, or just outright discrimination against that group. Instead, I think that the law is, and what might make sense is, if there's problem conduct happening in the bathroom, which we haven't seen any increase of since this clarification or since the law changed itself in 2006 here, but if there's something going on in the bathroom that's bad conduct, address the conduct, but I think that's separate from who the person is.
And I'm going to chime
Kelly, yes,
on.
yes, please.
I think we have seen a little bit of uptick in the policing. Just anecdotally on Facebook feeds and other things, you will see often white men going into restrooms after women who they think don't look feminine enough to see if they have the right to be there. And I think we are seeing more concern about that, and people going into restrooms for the policing purpose, not for the voyeurism and other purposes. And I think there was an instance, in fact, where this initiative used a woman was assaulted in a bathroom,
That's
and
right.
the campaign used her attack to try to promote their cause, and she said, "No, person was not pretending to be transgender or anything else. Don't use my assault in a bathroom that was horrific for your cause." And it's the confusion and the swirling and the policing and the. I do think that there's more hostility because of these anti-initiatives. So that's just my personal feeling.
Okay, we're right at the time for questions. So if you have a question and you're here in the audience, we're going to get you a microphone. And I see your hand up right now. And I know we may have online questions as well. We do have online questions. So go ahead.
Hi. So it's just more of a clarification, and I know we're talking about legal issues, but I hadn't heard mentioned, and I thought it was worth mentioning, that the American Academy of Pediatrics recognizes gender identity and transgenderism, and in fact recognizes that children can and should be identified at young ages. And as a parent of a transgender child, my number one most often heard objection is children can't identify that early, and they can. And it's not only the American Academy of Pediatrics, but all of the major medical associations recognize it. And I think that's the reason for these laws finally catching up.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And they've been increasingly weighing in through their lawyers to say so in court in these cases around the country, the American Medical Association and others. That's right.
Okay, I'm going to hold off on this question, take it online. We'll switch back and forth. So there we go. Megan.
Okay, we have our question online is for Colleen. We have a participant who's interested in how local human rights commissions in Seattle and Tacoma are working with your office to address and enforce transgender, sexual orientation, and other protected groups' rights in employment, education, and public accommodations. And they're hoping, if possible, that I think I got cut. You might be able to give an example and potentially a contact.
Yeah, well, my contact information is on our website at atg.wa.gov. If you Google Attorney General Washington Civil Rights, you'll find us, and you're welcome to reach out. In terms of partners, yes. So we work with partners across the state at the county and the local level to identify, refer, make sure that we're trying to cover as much field as we can on these issues. So if a city like Seattle has a really robust and, an able, kind of civil rights statute at the local level, it might be appropriate for them to handle something that comes up in the city, because not every city, Tacoma, Seattle, certainly Spokane has one, other municipalities have civil rights protections, but that's not true statewide. And so one of the things in my office that we try to remember is that we are an office with statewide jurisdiction, and so it's important for us to try to make sure that in those areas where there's not a separate civil rights protection at the city level, that the Washington law against discrimination is being enforced. But yeah, I have good relationships with folks in those offices, and we work together.
You have a question.
Ironically, as to the last question, I actually sit as a co-chair of the Seattle Human Rights Commission, and I'm happy to share my contact information. You've all identified a number of challenges that currently still exist on the ground in terms of protecting or implementing current law, addressing epidemics of violence against trans folks of color. I'm curious, in terms of the law on the books, are there areas that you can identify that could stand for further progress in the state of Washington?
And that's open to all three of you, so Gunnar.
I don't know about laws per se at the top of my head right now, but definitely policy. I mean, I think what the Human Rights Commission did is definitely needed. I worked with the city of Seattle on police policy on how to treat transgender victims as well as arrestees. We just worked with the city of Seattle on their HR policy on someone transitioning in the workplace. So those, which is my favorite wonky stuff to do, is like that, like very like ground level type of work. Interestingly enough, the Massachusetts case in Gloucester, I actually worked on the policy for a school system, and then they didn't follow it. So, so it's not just, it's like taking the law, interpreting it, and then also implementing it and continuing to do that, because it is culture change, is a long slog process. And laws help to move culture, but culture also helps to move laws, and so it's like figuring out which one are you doing first. So I think implementation and policy making, as well as training and education, are all still places that we have a long, long way to go, and that culture and society is actually sometimes moving a lot faster, especially when it comes to families with transgender children. We have not kept up pace with their needs and what's happening for them.
I think one area when I talk to trans advocates and people who sort of experience the criminal justice context from the trans perspective, what the Washington law against discrimination really doesn't cover inmates in county jails, and there's no statewide regulation of the jail context, and so it really is dependent on individual county policies. And what we know is that, much like all of these other contexts, there's a tremendous amount of anti-trans violence and sexual violence in jail that can be targeted at trans people. So having really robust laws and policies that promote safety in the jail context is one area where I hear a lot about from trans folks.
I would like to see the law clarified a little bit. Right now it says protected from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, including gender identity and gender expression. I think part of the language that we use in identifying gender identity and gender expression with sexual orientation helps create the confusion in the general public. There's a difference between biological sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression. And I think for a lot of people, that's still very confusing. The law is evolving, but as there's public debate about the things, people are confused if they haven't encountered people or they haven't had open discussions or family members about those things. So having a law that distinguishes sexual orientation from gender identity, I think is critical in helping facilitate those things, because it's inaccurate.
Megan, can you read another online? And then can we get the microphone to Carlo? But Megan, okay, then Carlo, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So an issue that arises with initiatives that revolve these sensitive topics is the language that is used in crafting the initiative, and that is seen and publicized by the public and to the public. And oftentimes the titles of the initiative and just the language can be accused of being misleading. And for example, the Just Want Privacy campaign has been criticized for the language. The ballot was predicated on the idea that trans students will create significant risks of embarrassment, shame, emotional harm, or psychological injury when sharing bathrooms with their non-trans classmates. So my question is, how do legal experts go about combating initiatives that mislead the public?
Colleen or Kelly or even Gunnar.
I think it's hard because there are certain buzzwords that are used, and we need to have more than soundbite conversations about them. I think on the national level where we're hearing this is in terms of religious liberty and free speech being used to promote discrimination against targeted groups. And I think we really need to unpack those terms and what they mean historically. So I don't know how. I know we need to. I think we also need to challenge them. So what is the privacy right that's being violated? One reason the Seventh Circuit case went down the way it did was there was no actual asserted violation of anybody's privacy. There were no facts to substantiate that anybody's privacy was violated. So we can talk about privacy, but how is your privacy violated by having a transgender person in the restroom? So it just plays on fears. But I think to the extent that we can unpack those things and really make words mean what they mean, we need to have civil dialogue about them rather than the sound bites, but I don't know how to do that.
I mean, my role isn't really to campaign for or against an initiative at all, but when I do my casework, I think one of the things that we really do look for is it is the specifics in the way that I think Kelly's talking about. And so we point out, for example, in a case where somebody's saying, well, bathroom crime or bathroom safety is a reason to do X or Y or exclude this or that person. And we say, show us when you come to court, you have to bring evidence. And so we require that you show us where it is in your record, in your experience, how many complaints, at what level, made by whom. Are you relying on to then make it maybe a more general comment about safety or fear? And when we do that deep dive and we don't find anything there that's really at the base of this allegation of fear and safety, we point that out as lawyers. And so I think that that's something that we've been doing in the various cases that we work on at the Attorney General's office, where there's really not a basis for the harm that's being claimed.
And just to talk about privacy, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the folks that end up don't get to have privacy are actually transgender people. I mean, thinking about when I changed my identity documents, how many doctor's letters I had to send in talking about what kind of surgeries I had. How many other folks have to do that? Like going into the RMV or the DMV, whatever you call it here, and saying like, here's my gender change papers, and like, who knows who's behind me? Before I was able to change my passport, I would be outed by TSA people. And they'd say, instead of saying Mr. Gunnerscott, they'd be go Miss Gunnerscott. And everybody hears it in line. And then my next thing is, well, I can't use a restroom unless I go to a different terminal. So, at the end of the day, when we talk about privacy, like transgender people aren't given the same equal affordability to privacy. And the system is still set up that way. And I think going back to what laws could we change, I think that's one of them is like, how do we, why do I have to disclose this much information about myself to somebody who's not my medical care provider? It's private medical information. And these are the conversations I have when we talk about policy level work, when employers want to put in an HR policy on how someone transitions, like you should not be asking for these things. It's not for you to know that. You don't ask it of other people. Says the non-lawyer.
I want to thank our three panelists. You guys were great. I want to thank the audience here for your questions and participation. Please, these are put on quarterly by the bar, so attend the next one. Thank you all.